Hello and welcome. My name is Evgeny Rusakov and you're watching your favorite TVP World program, Interview from Vilnius. Over the past year, relations between Washington, Kiev and Moscow have entered a new phase. While Russian officials continue to speak about the so-called spirit of Anchorage, many observers believe that Donald Trump's rhetoric and approach towards Ukraine may be evolving. Is this a genuine policy shift or simply a tactical adjustment? And what could it mean for Ukraine, Russia and the wider region? To discuss this, we are joined by Alexandra Filippenko, an American studies expert. Alexandra, glad to see you in our studio. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
Almost a year has passed since the Alaska summit. And since then, Russian officials have repeatedly referred to the so-called the spirit of Anchorage. So how do you think the White House has viewed this rhetoric?
I must say that the spirit of Anchorage is coming from the Kremlin. That spirit, I think, didn't exist for the White House because the White House didn't understand those words. What does it mean, the spirit of Anchorage? For the Kremlin, that meant some new understanding between Washington and Moscow. But for the White House, let's remember, how did Anchorage go? First of all, there was no joint press conference. They just read President Trump and Putin. They just read their statements the same way as any press secretary could have read that statement, and the journalist couldn't ask any questions. Then there was no lunch that was planned. There was no trip around Alaska looking at some monuments and Orthodox churches that was planned. So Donald Trump basically shut the door. He didn't want to continue sitting in the same room with Putin because there was no spirit of Anchorage. This idea was only coming from the Kremlin. So it is true that it never existed for the White House. I only saw it in Kremlin's rhetoric and sometimes European rhetoric trying to ask the question, what is that spirit of Anchorage? In the American blogosphere, in the American press, for the President of the United States, it didn't even exist.
Okay. So what do Marco Rubio's remarks rejecting Russian claims about the Ukraine peace agreement at the Alaska summit tell us?
First of all, it tells us that Marco Rubio is at the center of the negotiation process right now. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are busy with Iran. They're busy with those negotiations. They are now traveling to Switzerland with J.D. Vance. But Marco Rubio is now taking the stand. Now he is the person to talk to regarding Russia, regarding Ukraine. Let's remember that he barely existed in that sphere of negotiation. He was talking to Europeans, but he never spoke to journalists about some negotiation process with Russia. He spoke vaguely, not in concrete terms, but now he's saying no. There was nothing in Anchorage, and that's very important.
Okay, so what can we say about this spirit of Anchorage at this specific moment?
I must say that we should remember, and we've discussed this with you, President Trump has this special relationship with Putin, special feelings toward Putin, regarding Putin as the leader of a big country, a nuclear power, and we all should remember those tweets by President Trump, but then only businessman Trump from 2013, when he was traveling to Moscow and asking the question, when he travels there with the Miss Universe contest, will Putin come to the finale of that contest? We should always remember that. And we should remember the relationship toward President Zelensky, because President Zelensky for President Trump is the one who is associated with the first impeachment of President Trump. That's also very important to remember. But now, disregarding all that, but remembering that, but disregarding all that, there's a new way of approaching the war in Ukraine. There's a new way.
And that's what I wanted to talk about right now. So recently, many experts have noted that Trump's stance and rhetoric are shifting in Ukraine's favor. So what do you think is the main reason for this? And how long do you think it could last?
Well, that would sound not too good, let's say, not too good.
Optimistic?
Maybe not too optimistic, yes, but President Trump, he likes to be near the winner. He likes to be part of winning. And right now, where do we see the winning? On the front line, Ukraine, with hitting Russian oil refineries and other military objects on the territory of Russia. Ukraine is more successful. Everything is seeing those photographs, of course, within Moscow, the successful hits within Moscow. This is winning. This is obviously winning. And there is another very important point, and that is about President Zelensky's relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, for example, the head of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and
another character.
Yes, he is a character, absolutely. But for President Trump, he's a great friend. He's an important ally in the Persian Gulf. And right now, President Zelensky has this special relationship because Ukraine has the abilities to help all those Persian Gulf countries, taking into consideration, of course, the war in the Middle East.
There's my next question. What do you think was Putin's main mistake that may have contributed to this shift?
I think Putin and the Kremlin, they generally thought that they can play Trump forever, that they can play Trump, they can play Steve Witkoff, they can play Jared Kushner, and they didn't realize that there would be a point where President Trump would be tired of those constant negotiations. Of course, for the Kremlin, the main idea, the main goal is to drag time. They would like to see Steve Witkoff come to Moscow again, with Kirill Dmitriev. They can discuss whatever, the fights,
They would also probably like Donald Trump coming to Moscow or meeting him again somewhere else.
That would be amazing, because that would give a chance to Putin and to other cronies and his people around him to talk about history and why this war started. And that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. And they thought they can play Trump, but for Trump, there's finally this point where he does not understand why do you need to talk about history when there can be business. When business can be done also in the Arctic and elsewhere. But for President Trump right now, that's really a new point.
Okay. Again, Russian officials, Sergei Lavrov this time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, so he recently said that Moscow wants to understand whether the White House position on Ukraine has changed. Well, okay, it's obvious for me, it's obvious for you, but anyway. So does this suggest the uncertainty in the Kremlin about Washington's intentions, or is he, I don't know, or is the White House deliberately keeping its strategy ambiguous?
Well, the main point of the Kremlin is to talk about anything but the front line. Let's discuss the ideas. Let's discuss Anchorage. Did something change in Anchorage? Did something change starting from here or there or there or there? Talk about anything else but the reality, because the reality is terrible for the Kremlin. The reality is that the G7 countries have agreed not only to produce weapons in Ukraine, that's extremely important, but also to continue supporting Ukraine. And the statement that was signed by the United States is the most powerful one since basically the start of the full-scale invasion, if we take into consideration the G7 statements. Also, Mark Rutte, during the meeting of defense ministers in Brussels, he's answering the question: what's NATO's stance on the hitting refineries, hitting Russian military targets by Ukrainians? He asked to look at the statement of G7. So this means NATO and G7 countries they're thinking together. They're connected. Everyone is connected. So this is really something new. And for Kremlin, they want to talk about anything but that.
Is that a big blow?
That is a big blow. That is why they're trying to drag our attention to Anchorage or anything else, not the front line, not the reality. Their main point is not to talk about reality.
Okay, reality. So recent reports suggest that Trump privately urged Zelensky to take a bolder stance towards Russia, while publicly he and his administration continue to avoid directly criticizing Moscow, Kremlin, whatever. So how do you explain this this contradiction?
Well, President Trump, as a businessman, he's used to negotiating in different ways and using different tactics for different people. He thinks that he can continue having a special relationship with Putin because he really wants to do business with Russia in the Arctic. Because we should also remember that the Arctic has oil reserves, gas reserves, rare earths reserves, and the United States are very interested in the Arctic, and they really don't want China to be there. China is there because of Russia, so that is why that's a whole different conversation, but that's important for Trump to have that possibility to be the only, let's say, a superpower there. And of course, we don't talk about Russia as a superpower, obviously, but China is. China is moving into that direction. So for President Trump, that's important. And he wants to do business with Russia. Putin doesn't matter. But so that is why on the outside, he is keeping this posture of being potentially friendly. But on the inside, he is telling President Zelensky what we know from the sources.
If Trump's position is indeed evolving, how should Ukraine respond? What's your take?
Well, first of all, Ukraine, as we now see, is successfully moving on the front line. This is the main goal. This is the main point for President Trump, to see that Ukraine is winning. Again, coming back to that idea, Donald Trump likes to be with the winner. And the second thing is regarding the weapons. Right now we saw the first time in history the Pentagon used drones, Ukrainian drones, water drones, in their work. They didn't use them militarily, of course, but they tested them. They had a few tests with Ukrainian drones, and that is, of course, very important too. So possibly working with the Pentagon, working with the American military, helping American military, and extremely important, of course, working with the Persian Gulf countries, the great friends of President Trump.
Okay, final question. So does the Kremlin still have any leverage that could influence the White House's approach to Ukraine? And from what you've said, do you think the White House doesn't view Vladimir Putin as a winner anymore?
The White House doesn't see Vladimir Putin as a winner, that's for sure. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen that shift. The Kremlin still has, of course, we understand Russia still has leverage regarding the number of people, weapons, production of weapons. But the successful attacks of Ukraine to military targets on the territory of Russia, oil refineries and all that, are making things more difficult for Russia. But for now, we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. We shouldn't jump to conclusions. The situation is still very difficult. Ukraine still needs all the support from the European countries, but it looks like and it feels like, and I must say, I'm sorry for talking about feelings, but I've just been at Brussels at the headquarters of NATO, and the feeling is that the situation has really changed.
Okay, again then, do you think Putin has still anything to offer to Donald Trump except Arctic?
The Arctic. Also, there are two themes that President Trump is very interested in: nuclear weapons and possibly an agreement with China. Possibly an agreement with Beijing, including Beijing, because the New START treaty, the last treaty regarding nuclear weapons between Washington and Moscow, ended last year. So for President Trump, he talked about his willingness to see Beijing signing a nuclear weapons agreement. And Beijing was not optimistic about it. So Moscow maybe, we don't know, maybe can get China to sign that agreement, three-party agreement then.
Okay.
Then it would be Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. That's one thing, apart from
This
Arctic.
is where Russia could be useful as a mediator, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, with a special relationship with Xi Jinping, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing is space. This is the other issue that might be discussed disregarding the war in Ukraine. And over there, because for President Trump, he had these ideas of going to Mars, going to deeper space. Those are things that, yes, Putin still can offer to President Trump.
Okay, we'll see how the things evolve. Anyway, thank you for joining us today, and I really hope to see you once again in our studio.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And I would like to remind our viewers that our guest for today was Alexandra Filippenko, an American studies expert. You're watching TVP World. Stay with us.